The hiss of the steam engine was a long, mournful sigh, the sound of a world giving up. Mary Whitlow felt the same exhaustion deep in her bones, a weariness that had little to do with the rattling journey and everything to do with the reason for it. Outside the grimy window, the land was a study in brown and gray, a vast, unforgiving canvas that offered no comfort. A late spring snow, thin and spiteful, swirled in the wind, refusing to either commit to a proper storm or melt away into memory. It clung to the sparse, hardy pines that dotted the high plateau, dusting them in a coat of powdered sugar that looked more like ash in the flat light. Willow Bluff was not so much a town as a raw gash in the landscape. It had appeared on the horizon as a collection of unpainted wooden skeletons, huddled against the wind beside the glint of steel rails that stopped abruptly in the middle of nowhere. This was the end of the line, in every sense of the word. Mary clutched her small reticule, the worn leather cool against her nervous fingers. Inside, along with the few coins that were all she had left, was the ticket. It was a flimsy piece of paper, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone, bearing a name that was not her own. Eliza, a name she had whispered to the conductor with a tongue that felt thick and foreign in her mouth. The train jolted to a final, shuddering halt, a cacophony of shouts, whinnying horses, and the groan of wagon wheels filled the air. Mary took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and joined the slow shuffle of passengers disembarking onto the splintered platform. The wind immediately snatched at her, whipping her thin woolen shawl around her face and pressing her worn calico dress against her legs. She was a seamstress by trade. She knew good fabric from poor, and her own clothes were a testament to her dwindling fortunes. The platform was a chaotic mess of men, ranch hands in dusty denims and scuffed boots, prospectors with wild hope in their eyes, and a few grim-looking men in town suits who seemed to be overseeing the whole frantic enterprise. They all turned to watch the passengers, their gazes hungry and assessing, lingering on the few women who stepped down from the cars. Mary felt their eyes on her and pulled her shawl tighter, trying to make herself smaller. She was not looking for a husband. She was looking for her Aunt Susan's little sewing shop, a place to work her needle until her fingers bled if she had to earn enough to move on, to leave the whispers and the shame of her hometown 100 miles and a lifetime behind. Caleb Hart stood near the freight wagon, his back to the wind. He was not there to meet a woman. He was there for a crate of barbed wire and a sack of beans, necessities that kept his world turning. He watched the new arrivals with a practiced, dispassionate eye. He saw the desperation in the slump of a man's shoulders and the false bravado in another's stride. Then he saw her. She was younger than most, with hair the color of corn silk that the wind had teased from its pins. She clutched a small bag like it was the only anchor in a storm, and her eyes, wide and the color of a summer sky, darted around with a fear she was trying very hard to conceal. She looked as out of place as a songbird in a coyote den. A commotion broke out nearby. One of his men, Jed, a good hand with a rope but a fool with his pay, pushed through the crowd. Jed had been drinking his courage for a week, telling anyone who would listen about the bride he'd sent for. "That's her," Jed slurred, pointing a shaky finger at Mary. "That's my Eliza." Mary flinched as the stout, red-faced man lurched toward her. He smelled of whiskey and stale sweat. She took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Caleb moved before he'd consciously decided to. He put a firm hand on Jed's shoulder, his grip like iron. "Jed, that's enough. Go see to the horses." "But that's her, boss. My Eliza," Jed insisted, his gaze fixed on Mary. "The woman's scared of you. Now go on." Caleb's voice was low, but it held an authority that cut through Jed's drunken fog. Jed grumbled but shuffled off toward the wagon. Caleb turned his attention to Mary. He was a tall man, made taller by his worn boots and the flat brim of his hat. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hard years. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, held no warmth, only a quiet assessment. He looked from her to the ticket still clutched in her hand. "You, Eliza?" he asked. The words were not an accusation, just a question. Mary's throat went dry. Here it was, the first test of her desperate lie. She could not bring herself to speak the name aloud again, not to this man whose gaze seemed to see right through her. She could only give a small, jerky nod. He seemed to accept it. His expression did not change. "Jed's a good man when he's sober. You can wait at the general store. Mrs. Gable at the boarding house can find you a room." He gestured with his chin toward a large building down the dusty main street. And with that, he turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the platform. He did not look back. He had supplies to load, a ranch to run. A mail-order bride for one of his men was a complication, but not his problem. Still, the image of her wide, frightened eyes stayed with him. Mary watched him go, a strange mix of relief and unease settling over her. She made her way through the throng, heading for the address she had memorized, a place that promised a new start. But when she found it, her hope crumbled. The windows of the small shop were boarded over, a faded sign swinging crookedly on one hinge, a notice nailed to the door, yellowed and curling at the edges, announced that the property had been sold for back taxes months ago. Her Aunt Susan was gone. A cold dread, far more chilling than the wind, seeped into Mary's heart. She was alone, in a town that had already given her a name and a story that did not belong to her. She found the boarding house Caleb had mentioned. It was a tall, severe-looking building, run by a tall, severe-looking woman, Mrs. Gable's eyes raked over Mary, taking in her simple dress and the travel dust that clung to her. "A room," Mary said, her voice barely a whisper. "For how long, Mrs.?" Gable asked, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "Waiting for Jed. Are you heard he had one coming?" The words were casual, but the insinuation was clear. The rumor had traveled faster than she had. "I just need a room for a few nights," Mary managed, ignoring the question. "Until I can find work." Mrs. Gable sniffed, but showed her to a small, airless room at the back of the house. The price she quoted was twice what it should have been, but Mary had no choice but to pay for one night. As she sat on the lumpy mattress, the sounds of the town drifting up to her, she felt the walls closing in. She had run from one set of whispers only to find herself trapped in another. Later that evening, a knock came at her door. It was not Mrs. Gable. It was a man with a silver star pinned to his vest. He was thick-set, with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes. "Mary Whitlow?" he asked, though he said it like he already knew she was lying. He held up a passenger manifest. "It is," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm Sheriff Kincaid. We like to know who's coming and going in Willow Bluff. Your ticket says Eliza." "A mistake," Mary said quickly. "It was purchased for me by a friend." The lie tasted sour. The sheriff smiled, a slow, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "We get a lot of mistakes in this town. People looking for a fresh start. Problem is, they usually bring their old troubles with them. Mr. Pike, Abner Pike, he's investing a lot in this town. In the railroad, he doesn't like trouble, and neither do I. Understand?" Mary understood perfectly. He was marking her as an outsider, a vagrant. He was telling her she was not welcome. "I only intend to stay until I find honest work," she said, lifting her chin. "See that you do," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. He tipped his hat and was gone, leaving the scent of stale tobacco in the hallway. Panic gave way to a cold, hard resolve. She would not be run out of this town. She would not starve. The next morning, her money almost gone, she went to the general store. The place was a hub of activity, smelling of coffee, leather, and dust. And there, by the counter, was Caleb Hart. He was arguing with the proprietor about the price of flour. Mary waited, her hands clenched at her sides. When he finished, he turned to leave and nearly collided with her. He stopped, his gray eyes showing a flicker of surprise. "You're still here," he said. It was not a question. "Jed is not the man I was supposed to meet," she said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. It was not the whole truth, but it was a piece of it. Caleb's expression was unreadable. "That's between you and him." He made to move past her. "I need a job," she said, her voice ringing with a desperation that shamed her. "I heard you need a camp cook." He stopped again and really looked at her then. He saw the proud set of her jaw and the fear that still swam in her eyes. He saw her hands, the fingertips pricked and calloused from 1,000 stitches. They were not the soft, useless hands of a woman waiting to be cared for. He remembered his last cook, a grizzled old man who had quit after a week, complaining about the wind and the work. "It's no work for a woman," he said flatly. "You'd be up before dawn and in bed after midnight. The men are rough. The water's bad and the pay is low." "I'm a hard worker," she insisted, "and I'm not afraid of rough men." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. He was a man who believed in what he could see and touch the heft of a healthy calf, the tautness of a good fence, the honesty of a hard day's work. He saw something in her, a sliver of resilience that reminded him of the tough prairie grass that always grew back after a fire. He needed a cook. Badly. The men were complaining, and a crew with sour stomachs was a crew that made mistakes. "The work starts today," he said finally, his voice rough. "The wagon's out front. Be in it in 5 minutes." He walked out of the store without another word, leaving Mary standing between a barrel of pickles and a stack of wool blankets. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She had a job, a hard, miserable job, perhaps. But it was a chance. It was survival. 5 minutes later, she was sitting on the hard wooden seat of the buckboard wagon as it rattled out of Willow Bluff. She did not look back. Caleb Hart sat beside her, his hands firm on the reins, his eyes on the horizon. They rode in silence, the only sound the creak of the wheels and the ever-present moan of the wind. The landscape opened up, vast and empty. The sky a dome of pale, washed-out blue. The raw settlement gave way to rolling, arid plains. As the sun began to dip low, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange, they arrived at the camp. It was little more than a chuck wagon, a campfire, and a few bedrolls scattered under the open sky. A handful of cowboys stopped their work to watch them approach, their face curious and skeptical. Caleb pulled the horses to a halt. "This is May," he announced to the men, his voice carrying over the wind. He did not say Eliza. He did not say she was the bride Jed had been expecting. He just said her name. "She'll be cooking for us." He turned to her, his expression grim. "The stove is there. The supplies are in the wagon. The men eat when the sun goes down." And with that, he swung down from the wagon and went to tend to the horses, leaving her alone in the heart of this wild, lonely place. Mary stood for a moment, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, and looked at the cold, black metal of the chuck wagon stove. It was an ugly, intimidating thing, but it was also a promise. She had a few weeks to work, to earn, to become someone other than the girl who had arrived on the wrong ticket, with the wrong name, in the wrong town. She took a deep breath, the cold, clean air filling her lungs, and walked toward her new life. Life on the Hart Ranch was a lesson in exhaustion. The day began in a cold, black inkiness long before the sun had any notion of rising. Mary's first duty was the fire, her fingers stiff and clumsy as she coaxed a flame to life against the persistent, searching wind. Her first attempt at biscuits were blackened discs of charcoal on the outside and raw dough within. The coffee was thin and bitter. The cowboys, a jury of grim, hungry men, ate without complaint, but their silence was a verdict in itself. She was not a cook. She was a seamstress whose world had been needles and thread, not cast iron and bacon grease. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, unfamiliar soreness. She scrubbed pots with sand until her knuckles were raw, hauled buckets of water from the creek that made her shoulders scream, and battled the constant invasion of red dust that settled on every surface, in every fold of cloth, in the very food she prepared. Days were measured by the sun and the gnawing hunger of the men. Nights were short, a brief fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep on a thin bedroll under a blanket of stars so vast and indifferent it made her feel impossibly small. And then there was Ellie. The child was a ghost in the camp, a small, silent figure with enormous, watchful eyes and braids the color of dusty straw. She was the daughter of a hand who had died the previous winter, a man Caleb had promised to look after. The promise had extended to his child. Ellie moved with a quiet self-sufficiency that was unnatural in a 9-year-old. She did her chores, mending tack or polishing bits, with a solemn focus, never speaking unless spoken to. She watched Mary with a deep, unnerving curiosity, her gaze a mixture of childish suspicion and an old, weary wisdom. Mary tried to breach the silence. She offered Ellie a piece of cornbread saved from her own meager portion. The girl took it without a word, her small fingers just brushing Mary's, and retreated to the far side of the wagon to eat it, alone. Mary's heart ached for the child's solitude, a feeling so keen it was almost a physical pain. She knew what it was to be alone in a crowd. Weeks bled into one another. The biscuits slowly became less burned, the coffee stronger. Mary learned the rhythms of the camp, the meaning of a shift in the wind, the look of a sky that promised a dust storm. She learned the names of the men and how they took their coffee. She learned to bank the fire at night so a few hot coals remained for the morning. She was still clumsy, still a seamstress playing the part of a cook, but she was persistent, and in the small spaces between the endless chores, moments of her true self began to emerge. One afternoon, a lanky cowboy named Silas snagged his shirt sleeve on a nail, tearing a long, jagged rip from cuff to elbow. He swore, looking at the ruined garment with disgust. "Second one this month," he grumbled. "Have to ride to town for a new one." "Let me see it," Mary said quietly. Silas looked at her, surprised, but handed over the shirt. She took out her small sewing kit from her bag, a little leather roll that was her last connection to her old life, with a practiced efficiency that was almost mesmerizing. She smoothed the fabric, trimmed the frayed edges, and began to stitch. Her needle flew, small and swift, weaving a neat, nearly invisible seam where the tear had been. The men watched, their usual gruff talk stilled. In this world of brute force and hard labor, her delicate skill was a kind of magic. When she finished, she knotted the thread and bit it clean. Handing the shirt back to Silas, it was stronger than it had been before. He stared at the repair, then at her, a look of grudging respect in his eyes. "Much obliged, ma'am," he mumbled, and for the first time, one of them had called her something other than cook. From his spot by the corral, Caleb watched the exchange, his face impassive, but he saw the way she held the needle, the confident set of her shoulders. He saw a skill as real and as valuable as roping a steer. Another day, one of the horses, a young gelding, went lame, favoring its front left hoof. Caleb held the reins while Jed tried to examine the foot, but the horse was skittish, tossing its head and pulling back. "Hold still, you devil," Jed growled, trying to force the hoof up. "You're frightening him," Mary said, stepping forward before she could think better of it. Jed shot her an annoyed look. Caleb's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Mary began to speak to the horse in a low, crooning voice, the nonsense words soft and steady. She reached out not for the hoof, but for the horse's neck, stroking the tense muscles with a slow, gentle rhythm. The horse's ears flickered, its wild eyes softened. It stopped pulling against the reins and let out a soft snort, leaning into her touch. "There now," she whispered. "Easy now," keeping up the soft murmur. She ran her hand down the horse's leg, and this time, when Jed reached for the hoof, the animal allowed him to lift it, a small, Sharp rock was lodged in the frog. Once it was removed, the horse stood quietly, letting Mary give its neck one last reassuring pat. She stepped back, her face flushed, suddenly aware that all the men, including Caleb, were staring at her. She felt the need to explain. "My father used to say you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. It works for horses too, I suppose." She turned and hurried back to the fire, her heart thumping. Caleb said nothing, but that evening, after the men had settled into their bedrolls, he found Ellie sitting on a crate, trying to carve a piece of wood with a dull knife. She was struggling, her small face tight with frustration. He saw the nicks on her fingers. He watched for a moment, then went to his saddlebag and returned with a small, beautifully carved wooden horse. The lines were simple but perfect, the wood worn smooth. He knelt and held it out to her. Ellie looked from the horse to his face, her eyes wide with a question she could not voice. "Your father made this," Caleb said, his voice softer than Mary had ever heard it. "He wanted you to have it when you were old enough not to lose it." He placed it in her small hands. She clutched it, her fingers tracing the curve of its back. A single, silent tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. That night, a coyote howled close to the camp, a lonely, piercing sound. Mary, lying in her bedroll, heard a small whimper from the other side of the wagon, where Ellie slept. The whimper became a soft sob. Mary rose and crept over to the girl's side. Ellie was curled into a tight ball, clutching the wooden horse. "It's all right," Mary whispered, sitting beside her. "It's just a coyote singing to the moon." She began to hum, a simple, nameless tune her mother used to hum while she sewed. The melody was soft and gentle, a thread of warmth in the vast, cold darkness. Ellie's sobs subsided. After a few minutes, her breathing evened out into the slow rhythm of sleep. Mary stayed for a long while, humming softly, one hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder. She did not know that Caleb was awake, lying in his own bedroll, listening. He had not heard a woman sing a lullaby since his wife died. The sound was a ghost, stirring memories he had buried deep. It was a sound of home, a sound that did not belong in this desolate camp. And yet, it felt right. The fragile peace of the camp was not reflected in the world beyond it. Abner Pike's ambition was a shadow stretching over the whole territory. One afternoon, Caleb rode in from the north pasture, his face set in a hard, angry line. He dismounted and pulled a wooden stake from his saddle ties, throwing it to the ground. It was freshly cut pine, with survey markings painted on it. "Pike's men," he said to his foreman, "planted it a half-mile inside my property line. Claim the railroad survey gives them the right of way." "It's a lie. The official survey is filed at the county seat," the foreman said. "Pike is making his own truth," Caleb answered, his voice grim. "He's trying to squeeze us, all of us. He wants the land for a coal depot. He's been offering pennies on the dollar to the smaller ranchers. And for those who won't sell, he finds other ways. Fences get cut, wells get fouled." This was the real fight, the one for survival, and Caleb was on the losing side. The final blow, however, came not from Pike's men, but from the heart of Willow Bluff. Jed rode in from a trip to town, a newspaper and a grim look on his face. He avoided Mary's eyes. Handing the paper to Caleb, Caleb unfolded it, and his gaze fell on a small, boxed notice near the advertisements for patent medicine and saddles. It was from the Willow Bluff Seamstress and Mercantile. It announced, in bold letters, a warning to the good people of the town about fraudulent individuals arriving under false pretenses. It spoke of a certain impostor who had recently arrived, claiming to be a mail-order bride, a woman of low character who had deceived an honest, hard-working man. It did not name Mary, but it did not have to. Everyone in town knew who it was about. A cold sickness washed over Mary as she read the words over Caleb's shoulder. Her past had followed her after all. It had found her, and it had twisted itself into a new and uglier shape. 2 days later, Sheriff Kincaid rode out to the camp, his horse kicking up a cloud of red dust. He dismounted with a confident air, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Hart," he said, nodding to Caleb, but his eyes were on Mary. "I'm here on official business." "This is my land. Kincaid, state your business," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My business is with her." The sheriff pointed a thick finger at Mary. "There's been a formal complaint, attempted fraud, not to mention vagrancy. That notice in town makes it plain. You're not welcome here, Mr. Pike wants this valley to be a respectable place for families." The hypocrisy was so thick Mary could have choked on it. "She works for me," Caleb stated, moving to stand slightly in front of her. "She's no vagrant." "A temporary arrangement," Kincaid sneered. "I want her out of this county by the end of the week, for her own good. We have ways of dealing with troublemakers." He looked directly at Mary, his eyes small and cold. "Don't make me come back." He mounted his horse, gave Caleb a final, smug look, and rode away, leaving a tense, heavy silence in his wake. The cowboy shifted uncomfortably, not meeting her eyes. She was marked. She was trouble. All her hard work, all the small inroads she had made, had been erased by a few lines of ink. She looked at Caleb, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening dread. His face was like granite, his thoughts impossible to read. He was a man who hated complications, and she was the biggest complication he had ever faced. She had found a fragile foothold in this hard land, and now the ground was crumbling away beneath her feet. The week following Sheriff Kincaid's visit was a study in taut silence. The air in the camp, already thin and sharp, grew heavy with unspoken tensions. The cowboys, usually a boisterous and complaining lot, became quiet and watchful around Mary. They were polite, in a distant sort of way, but the easy camaraderie she had begun to foster with her mended shirts and gentle voice had vanished. She was a liability, a piece of trouble that had washed up in their midst, and Caleb Hart's stony silence was a clear signal that her time was limited. Mary felt their judgment like a physical weight, a constant pressure on her shoulders. She threw herself into her work, scrubbing pots until they gleamed, baking bread with a frantic energy, as if she could scour away their disapproval with sheer effort. She found her only solace with Ellie. The child seemed oblivious to the shift in the camp's atmosphere, or perhaps she was simply used to the quiet austerity of men. She began to bring Mary small treasures, a raven's feather, a curiously shaped stone, a wildflower that had somehow survived the arid soil. She would place them on the edge of the chuck wagon without a word, and Mary would thank her with a smile that felt like a betrayal of the grief in her own heart. The bond between them was a fragile, silent thing, a language of small gestures in a world of hard words. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, carried in the saddlebags of Silas, the lanky cowboy. On his return from a supply run to Willow Bluff, he brought mail, a rare and welcome event. He handed a few letters to the other men and then held out a last, slightly crumpled envelope. "This here's for Jed," he announced, a grin touching his lips. "Looks like your bride ain't forgot you after all." Jed, who had been nursing a sullen grudge ever since Mary's arrival and subsequent employment, took the letter with a suspicious frown. The other men chuckled, nudging him. Jed flushed a deep red and tore the envelope open with a clumsy finger. He squinted at the neat, looping handwriting, his lips moving as he slowly deciphered the words. His frown deepened into a look of utter bewilderment. He read it once, then a second time. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sweeping over the men and landing on Caleb. "Boss," he said, his voice thick with confusion, "this don't make a lick of sense." He walked over and handed the letter to Caleb. A profound stillness fell over the camp. Mary, who had been kneading dough on the wagon's tailgate, felt her hands freeze. Her blood went cold. Caleb took the letter, his expression unreadable. The silence was broken only by the whisper of the wind and the crackle of the breakfast fire. He read the page, his gray eyes moving methodically from line to line. Mary did not need to see the words to know what they said. She could imagine them perfectly. An apology, a change of heart, a name signed at the bottom, the name of the real Eliza. Caleb folded the letter with a slow, deliberate motion, the crisp sound of the paper unnaturally loud. He did not look at Jed. He did not look at the other men. His gaze lifted and found Mary. It was a flat, cold look, devoid of the grudging respect he had sometimes shown her. It was the look of a man who had been made a fool of. "Mary," he said, his voice as quiet and as sharp as a shard of ice. "Walk with me." It was not a request. He turned and started toward the creek, his long strides purposeful. The other men melted away, suddenly finding urgent tasks to attend to. Mary wiped her floury hands on her apron, her entire body trembling. This was it. The flimsy structure of lies she had built her new life upon was about to collapse. She followed him, her boots sinking into the soft earth at the creek's edge. He stopped and turned to face her, the morning sun at his back, casting his face in shadow. He held out the letter. "This is from a woman named Eliza Thompson in Kansas. She writes to Jed to tell him she isn't coming. It seems she had a change of heart. Funny thing is, she talks as if they've never met, as if he'd have no reason to think she was already here." Mary could not speak. The words were lodged in her throat, a painful, choking knot. She could only stare at the letter in his hand, the white paper a symbol of her undoing. Caleb's voice was still quiet, but it was edged with a hardness she had never heard before. "I am not a man who holds with complications, Mary, and I do not like being lied to. I asked you on that platform if you were Eliza. You nodded your head. You let Jed believe it. You let me believe it. I was desperate," she finally whispered, the words ragged. "I never meant to fool Jed. I never meant to be anyone's bride. I just needed to get away." Away from what the question was blunt, demanding. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. There was no point in any more half-truths. From my home, from a lie that was told about me. I was a seamstress. I worked for a man whose son, he was persistent. When I refused him, he told people that I had been improper with him. He was from a respected family. I was just a tailor's girl. No one believed me. The whispers, they followed me everywhere. I couldn't find work. My Aunt Susan in Willow Bluff was my only hope. I was at the station, and a woman was selling her ticket. She was supposed to be Jed's bride, but she got cold feet. I used my last dollar to buy it from her. I just wanted to get to my aunt's shop. I thought if I could just get here, I could start over. But when I got here, her shop was gone, and the story had already started, and I was trapped. The whole wretched story came tumbling out, a confession born of pure terror and exhaustion. He listened without interruption, his face a mask of stone. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the gurgle of the creek over the rocks. She searched his face for a sign of understanding, of pity, of anything but this cold anger. She found nothing. "So you ran from one lie by building another one," he said at last. His words were not cruel, but their simple, factual weight was devastating. "You brought your trouble with you. That notice in the paper, Sheriff Kincaid riding out here, that all happened because of this. Because you are not who you said you were." "But I have worked hard," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I have earned my keep. I have never been dishonest in my work for you. A person's word is all they have out here. Mary, it's the foundation everything is built on. Trust. A man's word that he'll stand by you in a fight. A rancher's word that his herd is clean. Your very first act in this valley was a lie." He looked away from her then, his gaze fixed on the far horizon. "I have a responsibility. To my men, to this ranch, but most of all, to that little girl back there." He gestured with his head toward the camp, toward Ellie. Her father was an honest man. I promised him I would keep her safe. I cannot have her raised up in the middle of this kind of trouble. I can't have Kincaid and his sort sniffing around my camp, making threats. He turned back to her, and his eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something that looked like regret. "You are a hard worker, I'll give you that, and you are good with the child, but that doesn't change the truth. When we finish this cattle drive, I will pay you what you are owed, plus enough for a ticket east or west. It makes no difference to me, but you cannot stay here." The finality of his words struck her like a physical blow. She felt the ground give way beneath her. She had been given a reprieve, a few more weeks of hard labor before being cast out once more. She nodded, unable to speak, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She turned and walked back to the camp, her back straight, her dignity the only thing she had left to cling to. The days that followed were worse than the first. The silence was no longer tense. It was a cold, settled thing, a finality. Caleb spoke to her only when necessary. His instructions about meals clipped and impersonal. The small moments of connection, the shared glance over a mended shirt or a calm horse, were gone. Ellie seemed to feel the chill most acutely. She still brought Mary her small gifts, but her eyes were full of a child's deep and troubled confusion. She would look from Mary's sad, set face to Caleb's granite profile, her small brow furrowed, as if trying to solve a painful puzzle. The world outside the camp continued to press in. Abner Pike was not a patient man. One afternoon, a rider galloped in from the southern pasture, his face grim. "The creek's gone to a trickle." "Boss," he reported to Caleb, rode upstream. "Pike's crew has built a dam, just inside his new survey markers. They've diverted most of the water into a holding pond." Caleb's jaw tightened until a muscle bunched in his cheek. Water was life. Diverting the creek was not just harassment, it was a declaration of war. It was an attempt to choke his ranch to death. 2 days later, another blow fell. 2 men sent to move a small herd to the common grazing lands to the east returned before nightfall. "New fence," one of them said, dismounting wearily. 3 strands of new barbed wire, strung right across the trail. "It's on heartland, but it blocks the access route. We'd have to drive the herd 10 miles north and around to get to the commons now." Caleb stood by the fire, staring into the flames. He was being hemmed in, cut off, his resources strangled one by one. He was in a fight for the land his father had settled, for the promises he had made to the dead. And as he stood there, he glanced over at Mary, who was quietly serving the men their evening meal. The trouble had started the day she arrived. It was not her fault. Not really. She was just a small piece in Pike's larger, ruthless game. But in his mind, the two had become tangled together. Her lie and Pike's. Both were eating away at the foundations of his world, and he only knew how to deal with one of them. The summer heat arrived without warning, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the high plains. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and the air grew still and thick with the smell of dust and dry pine. The trickle of water in the dammed creek bed shrank further, becoming a muddy, pathetic ribbon that offered no relief. The oppressive weather mirrored the oppressive mood of the camp. Mary moved through her days in a state of quiet resignation, a ghost counting down the hours to her own banishment. Caleb was a thundercloud on the horizon, his face perpetually grim, his mind clearly consumed by the tightening noose of Abner Pike's making. The only spark of warmth in Mary's world was Ellie, who now followed her like a small shadow, a silent companion in the stifling quiet. One sweltering afternoon, while the men were out checking the fences on the far side of the property, the sky began to change. The hazy white darkened to a bruised, sullen purple in the west. The air grew strangely electric, and the wind, which had been absent for days, began to stir in hot, erratic puffs. Mary, washing tin plates in a basin of precious water, glanced up at the horizon with a prickle of unease. It was the kind of sky that promised violence. Ellie had become attached to a young calf, a runty thing with a white star on its forehead that she had named, with a child's simple affection, Star. While Mary worked, Ellie was supposed to be keeping the calf and its mother in the small holding pen near the camp, but the oppressive stillness had made the cattle restless. The mother cow, agitated by the coming storm, suddenly kicked at a loose board in the fence, splintering it. In the confusion, the calf darted out, frightened by the noise and the strange energy in the air, and bolted toward the dry creek bed. "Star!" Ellie cried, her voice thin with panic. She scrambled through the broken fence and ran after the calf, her small legs pumping. "Ellie, no, come back!" Mary shouted, dropping a plate with a clatter, but the child did not hear or did not listen, her focus entirely on the frightened animal. A low, distant rumble echoed through the valley. The wind picked up, whipping Mary's skirts around her legs. She saw Ellie chasing the calf down the sloping bank of the arroyo. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose rock and dry, crumbling earth. A flicker of movement far upstream caught Mary's eye, a dark line moving with unnatural speed. The dam, Pike's Dam. The storm must have hit hard in the high country. "Ellie!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. She did not wait for an answer. She did not think about Caleb or the men or her own safety. She ran. Her worn boots slipped on the loose gravel as she scrambled down the bank. The rumble was a roar now, a hungry, angry sound that seemed to shake the very ground. The dark line she had seen was now a churning wall of brown water, debris and foam, pouring down the narrow channel. A monster unleashed. The flash flood hit the bend in the creek just as Mary reached the bottom. The calf, spooked by the noise, had turned back. Ellie, seeing the wall of water, froze, her face a small, white mask of terror. Mary lunged, grabbing the child by the arm and pulling her back just as the first wave slammed into the bank where she had been standing. The ground dissolved into mud and water. Mary lost her footing, her feet sliding out from under her. She fell backward, pulling Ellie with her, into the churning, icy current. The shock of the cold water stole her breath. It was a living thing, a powerful, violent animal that clawed and pulled at her. She went under, swallowing a mouthful of gritty water, and came up sputtering, her arm locked around Ellie's small, thin body. The child was rigid with fear, clinging to her with a desperate strength. "Hold on to me," Mary gasped, fighting to keep both of their heads above the surface. The current was impossibly strong, dragging them downstream. Her long skirt became a leaden weight, tangling around her legs. A submerged log slammed into her side, and she cried out in pain, but her grip on Ellie never loosened. The force of the water tore at her clothes. She felt the seam of her sleeve give way, the fabric of her bodice ripping against a sharp, unseen branch. She was being battered, stripped, and tumbled in the violent chaos, her only thought to shield the child, to keep that small head above the churning brown water. Caleb had seen the sky from the north ridge and had spurred his horse into a hard gallop back toward camp, a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He heard the roar of the flood before he saw it. Then he heard the scream. It was a sound that ripped through him, a sound of pure terror that he recognized as Mary's. He broke through the trees just in time to see them, two heads bobbing in the torrent. For a moment, his heart stopped. He saw Mary's pale arm holding Ellie, keeping her afloat as they were swept past. He did not think. He reacted. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks, urging the powerful animal down the crumbling bank and into the shallows, his rope already in his hand. He threw the loop with a desperate, practiced skill. It fell perfectly, settling over Mary's shoulders. "Hold on," he roared, his voice nearly lost in the noise of the flood. He braced his horse, the animal straining against the powerful current. He slowly, carefully, began to back the horse out of the water, pulling them from the main force of the current and into the relative calm of the flooded bank. When they were in water shallow enough to stand, Mary stumbled, her legs giving out. Caleb was off his horse in an instant, splashing through the muddy water to reach them. He lifted Ellie from her arms, the child shivering and coughing but blessedly unharmed, and handed her up to one of the other cowboys who had just ridden up. Then he turned back to Mary. She was on her hands and knees, trying to push herself up, her whole body trembling violently from cold and shock. Her beautiful hair was a tangled, muddy mess. Her simple dress was in tatters, ripped and torn away by the fury of the water, leaving her exposed to the cold wind and his gaze. He saw the angry red scrapes on her arms and the dark bruise already forming on her ribs where the log had struck her. He stripped a coarse wool blanket from one of the bedrolls near the wagon and went to her. As he knelt, he reached out to wrap it around her shivering shoulders. And it was then that his own hands began to tremble. It was a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in his gut and shot through his arms. The cowboy's hands trembled, but he could not look away. It was not desire that held his gaze. It was a raw, staggering awe. He was not seeing a woman in a state of undress. He was seeing the fierce, unyielding spirit that had kept her and his child alive. He was seeing the courage of a woman who had, without a moment's hesitation, thrown herself into the path of death to save a little girl who was not her own. The lie about the ticket, the trouble with the sheriff, all of it evaporated in that moment, burned away by the sheer, blinding truth of her character. He had been so wrong. He had judged her for a small, desperate act of survival, and had been completely blind to the strength and goodness that lay beneath. What he felt was not lust, but a profound, gut-wrenching fear of what he had almost lost, and a wave of respect so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He wrapped the blanket tightly around her, tucking it in to shield her from the wind. For a moment, his trembling hands brushed the cold skin of her shoulder, and the touch was a shock, an electric current of pure, unvarnished emotion. He forced himself to look away then, to grant her the dignity she deserved. He stood and, without a word, shrugged off his own heavy canvas coat and draped it over her as well. The coat was warm from his body and smelled of leather and horse and him. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual, thick with an emotion he could not name. She nodded, her teeth chattering. He put a hand under her elbow, his touch firm and steady despite the tremor that still shook him, and helped her to her feet. He kept his arm around her as he led her slowly, carefully, back toward the warmth of the campfire, shielding her small, battered frame with his own body. The news of the flood and the rescue traveled, as news always did, but it became twisted and ugly in the telling. A prospector, heading to town, had seen the end of the incident from a ridge across the valley. By the time the story reached the saloon in Willow Bluff, it was a sordid tale. Caleb Hart had been found down by the creek with his cook, the so-called mail-order bride. The girl had been without a stitch of clothing, they said with a wink and a nudge. The tale of heroism was lost, replaced by a salacious whisper that solidified Mary's reputation as a woman of loose morals, further cementing her as an outcast. But in the small, isolated world of the Hart Ranch, something had fundamentally shifted. The cold silence between Mary and Caleb was gone, replaced by a quiet, fragile awareness. He saw her now, not as a complication or a liar, but as the woman who had saved his child. He realized, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could no more send her away than he could stop the sun from rising. She had, in one terrifying, selfless act, become essential. The wall he had built around his heart, the one fortified by grief and loneliness, had been irrevocably breached. In the days following the flood, the very air on the ranch seemed to have been washed clean. The oppressive heat broke, and a fragile, tentative quiet settled over the camp, different from the cold silence that had preceded it. The cowboys treated Mary with a new, profound respect. They had seen her courage, and in their world of simple, harsh truths, that was a currency more valuable than gold. Caleb, however, was the most changed. The distance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a watchful intensity. He looked at her now, truly looked, and what he saw seemed to both trouble and anchor him. 3 evenings after the rescue, as Mary was banking the fire for the night and the last of the embers pulsed a soft orange against the deepening twilight, he approached her. He did not speak for a long moment, simply stood there. his tall frame a silhouette against the star-filled sky. "The cattle drive will be over in 2 weeks," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "My offer of a ticket out of here still stands. It would be the easiest thing for you, to go somewhere no one knows you, where there are no stories." Mary's heart, which had begun to feel a fragile sense of belonging, sank. She kept her eyes on the fire, not wanting him to see the sudden sting of tears. She nodded, unable to form a reply. "But that is not what I am asking," he continued, and she looked up, surprised. His face was serious, his gray eyes searching hers in the dim light. "I am asking you to stay, not as a cook, but as part of this place, as part of this family." He stumbled over the last word, as if it were foreign on his tongue. "But there are conditions. There can be no more secrets between us. Not ever. The truth, no matter how hard it is, and the trouble that's coming, the trouble with Pike in this town, we face it together. I will not have you run, and I will not run. It will not be easy. The whispers in town will only get louder. They will be uglier. Staying will be the hardest thing you have ever done." He was offering her not a sanctuary, but a battlefield. He was offering her a place to stand and fight, not a place to hide. It was the most honest and the most terrifying offer she had ever received. To stay meant facing the shame, the lies, the constant threat of men like Kincaid. But to leave meant losing the only 2 people who had ever made her feel she was worth fighting for. She looked past him, to the small shape of Ellie, asleep in her bedroll, clutching the little wooden horse. "I will stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "and there will be no more secrets." A flicker of something, perhaps relief, crossed his face before the mask of stoicism fell back into place. "Good," he said. It was all he needed to say. He turned and walked to his own bedroll, the conversation over. But a line had been drawn, and they now stood on the same side of it. The next morning, the ranch transformed. It was no longer a place of waiting, but a place of war. Caleb gathered the men at dawn. "Pike has our water," he said, his voice clipped and hard, "so we will take it back." They spent the next week engaged in backbreaking labor. Caleb, using his own survey maps, showed them how Pike's illegal dam had diverted the water just before a narrow, rocky section of the creek. Armed with shovels and picks, they began to dig a new channel, a deep irrigation ditch that would bypass the dam and redirect what little flow was left onto Caleb's parched pastures. Mary worked alongside them. She was not as strong as the men, but she was tireless, her hands blistering and then hardening as she shoveled earth and hauled rocks. She saw the surprise and then the deep respect in the men's eyes as she refused to quit, her face smudged with dirt, her muscles screaming in protest. At night, they set up a watch. 2 men, armed with rifles, would patrol the perimeter of the camp and the new ditch until dawn. Pike's tactics were escalating, and Caleb would not be caught unprepared. He also rode out to the neighboring ranches, his face set in grim lines. He met with Old Man Hemlock, a rancher whose family had been on the land even longer than the Harts. He spoke of Pike, of the falsified survey markers and the stolen water. Hemlock listened, his weathered face grave, and agreed to let Caleb's herd graze on a section of his northern pasture in exchange for 2 of Caleb's best bulls. It was a small victory, a sign that they were not entirely alone. In the small moments of rest between the relentless work and the tense watches, a new, quiet domesticity began to bloom. One evening, Mary found Ellie trying to copy the lettering on a sack of flour with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood. The child's brow was furrowed in concentration. Mary sat beside her. "That's a bee," she said softly, taking the charcoal. "It's for beans. It starts like this." She drew a tall, straight line, and then 2 graceful curves. Ellie watched, mesmerized. From that day on, after the supper plates were cleaned, Mary would spend half an hour teaching Ellie her letters. The lessons were a small island of peace in their turbulent world. Caleb would often stand at the edge of the firelight, watching them. A look on his face that Mary could not quite decipher. It was a look of profound longing, of seeing something he thought had been lost to him forever. One night, a fierce wind kicked up, rattling the chuck wagon and making the fire dance wildly. Mary was awakened by a small, frightened cry. It was Ellie, caught in a nightmare. Mary went to her, smoothing the hair back from the child's damp forehead. Ellie was thrashing in her sleep, her small hands clenched. "It's all right," Mary whispered. "I'm here." Ellie's struggles subsided, and she sank back into a deeper sleep. But just before she did, she murmured one sleepy word. "Ma." The word, so soft it was almost lost in the wind, struck Mary's heart with the force of a physical blow. She froze, her hand hovering over the child's head. It was the name of a ghost, the name of a role she had never dared to imagine for herself. It was a name that meant home, and safety, and love. Tears she did not know she was holding back streamed down her face. She was not a cook. She was not a runaway. She was not a lie in the heart of this lost, lonely child. She was a mother. The following Sunday, Caleb made a decision. "We're going to town," he announced at breakfast. "All of us." A tense silence fell over the men. Town was a place of whispers and threats. "It's time we stopped hiding from it," he said, his gaze meeting Mary's. It was a challenge and a promise. She washed and put on her best dress, a simple gray muslin she had mended a dozen times. She braided her hair neatly and pinned it up, her hands steady. She helped Ellie into a clean pinafore. When they were ready, Caleb brought the wagon around. He lifted Ellie onto the seat, then turned and offered his hand to Mary. It was the first time he had ever made such a gesture. His hand was calloused and strong, and as her fingers touched his, she felt a current of strength pass between them. She held her head high as they rode into Willow Bluff. The town stared. People stopped on the boardwalks to watch them pass, their faces a mixture of curiosity and open hostility. Whispers followed them like a cloud of biting flies. Mary could feel the heat of their judgment, but with Caleb's solid presence beside her and Ellie's small hand tucked in hers, she did not flinch. They tied the wagon in front of the small, white-painted church, just as the bell began to toll for the Sunday service. As they walked up the steps, Sheriff Kincaid, who had been lounging against the porch rail, pushed himself off the post, blocking their way. Abner Pike stood nearby, a smug smile on his face. "Well now, Hart," Kincaid said, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I didn't figure you for a church-going man, especially not in this company." His eyes, small and mean, flickered over Mary. "There's a warrant here, a complaint sworn by Jedediah Jones, for marriage fraud. Seems this woman came here under false pretenses, intending to deceive an honest man." The crowd murmured, pressing closer. Mary's face went pale. She had known this was coming, but the public humiliation was a fresh, sharp pain. Before she could speak, before the fear could take hold, Caleb stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the pistol on his hip. He simply looked at Kincaid with an unnerving calm. "This woman is under my protection." "Sheriff," he said, his voice clear and carrying in the Sunday morning air, "any complaint you have is with me." He turned his back on the sheriff, a deliberate and profound insult. He looked at Mary, his eyes holding hers. Then, in front of the entire town, in front of the smug face of Abner Pike and the corrupt authority of his sheriff, Caleb Hart reached out and took Mary Whitlow's hand in his own. He did not just touch her fingers, he laced his through hers. A firm, possessive, and deeply protective grip. He held her hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if they had done it 1,000 times before. He squeezed it gently, a silent message of reassurance. With his other hand, he took Ellie's, and together, the three of them walked past the stunned sheriff and through the doors of the church, a silent, defiant family, leaving the whispers and the hatred on the steps behind them. Inside, they sat in a pew near the back. The whole congregation turned to stare. But then the minister, Reverend Hale, a thin man with kind, tired eyes, stepped up to the pulpit. He looked out over his flock, his gaze lingering for a moment on Caleb, Mary, and Ellie. He did not speak of fraud or of sin. He spoke of grace. He spoke of the woman brought before the Pharisees, and of the words of Jesus, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." He spoke of second chances, and of how a community is judged not by its righteousness, but by its compassion. His words were a gentle rain on the hard, judgmental ground of Willow Bluff, and as he spoke, some of the hardened faces in the congregation began to soften. Mary felt the tension in her shoulders ease. She was still an outcast, but for the first time, she felt she was not entirely alone. Caleb's public defiance at the church did not bring peace. It was a stone thrown into a nest of snakes, and now the snakes were stirring. The victory felt hollow, temporary. Abner Pike was not a man to accept public humiliation, and Sheriff Kincaid was his instrument. A sense of foreboding hung over the ranch, heavier than the dry summer heat. They doubled the night watch, and the men kept their rifles close. But the attack, when it came, was not one they could meet with bullets. It came on a moonless, windy night, the kind of night when the dry grass whispered secrets and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The camp was quiet, the men exhausted from another long day of digging and reinforcing their precious water channel. Mary had just tucked Ellie into her bedroll, the child's breathing already deep and even, her hand curled around the little wooden horse. Mary stood for a moment, watching the rise and fall of the small blanket, a fierce, protective ache in her heart. She exchanged a brief, tired glance with Caleb across the fire. In his eyes, she saw the same weariness, the same constant, gnawing worry that lived inside her now. It was a silent, shared burden. It was Silas, on the first watch, who smelled it first. A sharp, resinous scent that was not pine, carried on the gusting wind. Then he saw it, a faint, unnatural orange glow, low against the blackness of the eastern horizon, in the direction of the common grazing lands where they had moved the herd. "Fire!" His voice was a raw shout that ripped through the quiet camp. In an instant, the world erupted into chaos. Men scrambled from their bedrolls, pulling on boots and grabbing weapons. Caleb was on his feet, his face a hard, grim mask in the flickering firelight. He needed only a single glance at the rapidly brightening glow to know the truth. This was no lightning strike. This was Pike's answer. "Silas, Jed, get the horses!" he barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Ride for the herd. Drive them west, toward the rocks. Now! The rest of you, grab shovels, blankets, anything you can carry." The fire was moving with terrifying speed, fanned by the relentless wind. What had been a glow was now a visible line of flame, a roaring, hungry beast consuming the dry pasture, crowned with a billowing cloud of black smoke that blotted out the stars. It was coming straight for them. "We'll make a stand at the creek bed," Caleb yelled over the roar. "We have to backburn. It's our only chance." They worked with a desperate, frantic energy. The men, guided by Caleb's sharp commands, began digging a wide trench in the dry earth. A last, desperate line of defense. Others followed Caleb, carrying lit torches. They began setting a new fire, a controlled burn that would move toward the main blaze, consuming the fuel in its path. It was a dangerous, terrifying gamble. Mary's mind raced. She was not a ranch hand. She could not swing a pick or ride into the smoke, but she would not be useless. "Ellie," she said, her voice sharp with urgency as she gently shook the sleepy, frightened child. "Stay by the chuck wagon. Do not move from there. Do you understand me, no matter what?" Ellie, her eyes wide with terror at the roaring monster of flame, nodded numbly, clutching her wooden horse. Mary grabbed the water buckets. She tore strips from a clean flour sack, soaking them in water. She ran to the men digging the fire break, handing them the damp cloths. "Tie this over your face," she commanded, her voice steady despite the hammering of her own heart. She worked in a blur, refilling buckets from the dwindling water barrels, her arms straining, her lungs burning from the smoke. She was a shuttle, weaving between the frantic, soot-covered men, offering water, a damp cloth, a word of encouragement. This was her fight, too. This was her home they were trying to burn. Her hands, already calloused from digging the irrigation ditch, were scraped raw on the splintered wood of the wagon and burned by the hot metal of a bucket handle. But she did not stop. The heat was immense, a physical blow that drove them back. The air was thick with choking smoke and flying embers that stung like angry wasps. The roar of the main fire was a constant, deafening presence. Caleb, his face black with soot, his eyes red-rimmed and fierce, saw a section of the backburn leap across their newly dug trench, carried by a sudden, vicious gust of wind. A new line of fire ignited behind them, cutting them off. He swore, shouting new orders, when a flicker of movement in the darkness to the north caught his eye. Away from the main blaze, a lone figure on horseback was silhouetted against the flames, watching, not fighting, just watching. A cold, hard fury rose in Caleb, displacing his fear. He grabbed a rifle from his saddle and, without a word, slipped away from the fire line, using the smoke and chaos as cover. He moved like a shadow, his boots making no sound on the dry earth. He circled wide, coming up behind the watcher. The man was so intent on the destruction he had wrought that he did not hear Caleb approach until it was too late. Caleb saw the glint of a metal can in the man's hand. A kerosene lamp, the proof. Caleb launched himself from the darkness. Tackling the man from his horse, they hit the ground in a tangle of limbs. Caleb's rage gave him a savage strength. He landed a hard punch to the man's jaw, then another. He ripped the kerosene lamp from the arsonist's hand just as another horse thundered up, and a familiar, hateful voice cut through the roar of the fire. "That's enough. Hart." Sheriff Kincaid sat on his horse, his pistol drawn and aimed squarely at Caleb's chest. The arsonist, a known hired hand of Pike's, scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. "This man works for me," Kincaid said, his voice smug. "We were just riding out to check on the fire, offer our help." "He started it," Caleb growled, getting to his feet, the kerosene lamp clutched in his hand like a weapon. "I caught him. Here's your proof, Sheriff." "All I see is you assaulting an innocent man," Kincaid said, his pistol unwavering. "Now drop the lamp and step away." It was a standoff, the lawman and the landowner, with a wall of fire as their backdrop. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger of his own rifle. All the frustration, all the injustice of the past months, boiled down to this one moment. He could end it, here, now. And then he heard the scream. It was Ellie. His head snapped around. The fire had jumped the creek bed in another spot. A pincer movement of flame. A ring of fire was rapidly closing around the chuck wagon. And in that shrinking circle of blackened, smoldering grass was his child. In her panic, she must have run from the wagon, perhaps dropping her precious toy, and had gone back for it. Now she was trapped. Mary saw it at the same instant. Without a thought, without a cry, she ran, she plunged into the smoke, her arm thrown over her face, running straight toward the terrified child and the encircling wall of fire. Caleb's world narrowed to a single, terrible point of focus. To his right was Kincaid, Pike's man, the symbol of the injustice that was trying to destroy him. In his hand was the proof he needed, the justice he craved. But in front of him, through a haze of smoke and shimmering heat, were Mary and Ellie. His land was burning. His past was burning, but his future was about to be consumed by the flames. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an instinct, a truth that rose from the deepest part of his soul. The land was just dirt. The fight was just pride. They were everything. He dropped the kerosene lamp. He let his rifle fall to the ground. He turned his back on Kincaid and the stunned arsonist, ignoring the sheriff's taunting laugh. He ran through the smoke, his lungs screaming, his eyes fixed on the two figures silhouetted against the fire. He reached them just as Mary snatched Ellie into her arms. The child was coughing violently, her face streaked with tears and soot. Mary's dress was smoldering at the hem, her hair singed. Caleb did not speak. He scooped Ellie's small, light body into one arm. With the other, he wrapped a powerful arm around Mary's waist, half lifting, half dragging her. "This way," he yelled, his voice a raw rasp. He found a low spot where the flames were thinner and plunged through, shielding them with his body as a wave of heat washed over them. He did not stop until they were on the far side of the creek. On safe, unburned ground, he gently set Ellie down, who clung to him, sobbing. He turned to Mary, who was leaning against a rock, gasping for breath, her face pale beneath the grime. He reached out and touched her cheek, his soot-stained fingers leaving a streak on her skin. Their eyes met through the smoke-filled air, and in that moment, an entire world of understanding passed between them. He had made his choice. He had chosen them. He had chosen family. He took one last look at the inferno, at his burning pasture. Kincaid and his man were gone, vanished back into the night. The fight was not over, but its nature had changed. He looked down at the child in his arms, and at the woman who had saved her twice. The fire could take the grass would grow back, but this, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, this was irreplaceable. The dawn that broke after the night of the fire was a pale, sickly thing. A thick haze of smoke hung in the valley, and the rising sun was a weak, bloodshot eye staring down at a landscape of black and gray. The fire had been stopped at the creek, but half of Caleb's best pasture was gone, a charred wasteland that smelled of ash and defeat. The men moved like ghosts through the morning, their faces stained with soot, their bodies slumped with an exhaustion that went bone deep. Yet, there was no talk of leaving. The fire had not broken them. It had forged them. They were a grim, weary family surveying the ruins of their home. Mary moved through the devastation in a haze of her own, tending to the men's burns with soft cloths and clean water, her own minor injuries forgotten. She made coffee, a small, normal ritual in a world that had been turned upside down. Ellie stayed close to her side, her small face streaked with grime, her eyes still wide with the memory of the flames. She did not let go of Mary's hand. Caleb worked silently, his face an unreadable mask of granite, but his eyes followed Mary's every move. The choice he had made in the heart of the fire had settled between them, a silent, unbreakable truth. He had let his proof against Pike turn to ash, but he had saved them. A few days later, while sifting through the wreckage near the chuck wagon, Mary's hand closed on a splintered piece of a crate. It was branded with the name of Pike's Mercantile Company. Below the name was a small, stylized carving of a pickaxe crossed over a shovel, the company's emblem. She stared at it, her mind working, and then a memory, sharp and clear, flashed through her thoughts. It was the memory of Caleb, weeks ago, throwing one of Pike's illegal survey stakes to the ground in anger. She remembered seeing a similar, hand-carved mark near the bottom of the stake, just below the painted numbers. It was not the company emblem. It was cruder, a personal mark, a small, distinctive notch, like a tiny lightning bolt. It was a detail a man might overlook, but a seamstress, whose life was a study in tiny, precise details, would not. She found Caleb by the newly dug irrigation ditch, staring at the pathetic trickle of water that was their lifeline. She held out the piece of crate. "Do you remember the survey stake you found the one Pike's men planted?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent. He looked from the branded wood to her face, a question in his eyes. "It had a mark on it," she continued, her words coming faster now. "A little carving, near the bottom. Not this emblem. Something different. Do you still have it?" A flicker of understanding lit his gaze. He nodded slowly. "I threw it in the back of the supply wagon. They found it buried under a pile of burlap sacks." It was just as she remembered. There, at the base, was the crude but distinctive carving of a tiny lightning bolt. "This is a maker's mark," she said. her finger tracing the small grooves. "It is not a surveyor's mark. Whoever made this stake for Pike puts this on their work. I would wager that all the fake markers have it, and the real ones do not." It was a small thing, a fragile thread of hope, but it was more than they had. "Mr. Abernathy," Caleb said, the name coming to him after a moment. "The county land registrar. He's an old man, honest but timid. He has the official survey maps." The next day, they rode into Willow Bluff, not with defiance, but with a quiet, desperate purpose. They went not to the church or the saloon, but to a small, dusty office at the back of the courthouse. Elias Abernathy was a man who seemed to be made of dust and paper, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and ink stains on his fingers. He was nervous, his eyes darting toward the window as if expecting Pike or Kincaid to materialize at any moment. Caleb spoke in low, reassuring tones, explaining their suspicions. Mary laid the marked stake on the desk beside the branded piece of crate. "We believe Pike has been replacing the official county markers with his own," she said, "and we believe his markers are all signed. In a way." The old man's hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the official plat map of the territory, its linen paper yellowed and cracked with age. He weighed it down with books. 4 hours. They worked by the light of a single kerosene lamp, the only sounds the rustle of paper and their own quiet voices. Abernathy, his initial fear giving way to a scholar's righteous indignation, showed them the locations of the official stone and iron markers. Caleb, his knowledge of the land absolute, described where he and other ranchers had found the new wooden stakes. Mary, with her sharp eye and steady hand, began to draw a new map on a fresh sheet of paper, a comparison map, a map of the truth, and a map of the lies. By late afternoon, it was complete. The pattern was undeniable, a systematic, deliberate campaign of fraud, all marked with the tiny, arrogant signature of a lightning bolt. Their quiet work was interrupted by a commotion in the street. A man on a fine horse, a stranger, had ridden into town. He was not a cowboy or a prospector. He wore a dark, well-fitting suit and a city hat, and there was an air of calm, unassailable authority about him. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and, after a brief, tense exchange with a deputy, walked inside. 10 minutes later, he emerged, followed by a pale and sweating Sheriff Kincaid. The stranger walked with a purpose that drew the attention of the entire street. He walked straight to the courthouse and into Mr. Abernathy's dusty office. He introduced himself as Deputy United States Marshal Evans. He looked at Caleb, and then at the map spread across the desk. "I believe you are Caleb Hart," he said. His voice was calm, but it held the weight of federal law. "I am here in response to a petition sent to the territorial governor's office some weeks ago. A petition signed by you, a Mr. Hemlock, and 4 other ranchers in this valley, detailing accusations of land fraud, intimidation, and corruption." Caleb stared at him, stunned into silence. The petition, their last desperate appeal to a higher authority, had been answered. Marshal Evans looked at the maps. "It appears you have been doing my work for me," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. He listened intently as Mary, her voice clear and steady, explained her discovery, pointing to the marks, showing how the new map exposed the systematic theft of land and water rights. When she was finished, Evans rolled up her map with a decisive snap. "Mr. Abernathy, I will require your official testimony." He turned to Caleb. "Mr. Hart, I believe it is time we paid a visit to Mr. Pike." They found Pike in the saloon, holding court with a glass of whiskey in his hand. Sheriff Kincaid stood beside him, trying to look imposing, but succeeding only in looking terrified. Marshal Evans unrolled Mary's map on a card table. "Abner Pike," he said, his voice cutting through the saloon's sudden silence. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit land fraud against the United States government." Pike laughed, a short, ugly sound. "On what grounds?" "The word of a disgraced rancher and his mail-order tramp." "On the grounds of this evidence, Evans said, tapping the map. "And on the testimony of the man you hired to set fire to Mr. Hart's property last week." He nodded toward the door. Two of his deputies, who had arrived unnoticed, stood there, and between them was the arsonist Caleb had caught, his face a mask of fear. Under the unyielding pressure of a federal marshal, the hired hand had confessed everything. The color drained from Pike's face. He looked at Kincaid, his eyes blazing with fury. "Do something!" he snarled. But Kincaid was already defeated. Evans walked over to him, plucked the silver star from his vest, and dropped it on the floor. "You are relieved of duty. Kincaid, you are also under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy." As the deputies led the two men away, a stunned silence held the saloon in its grip. The reign of Pike and Kincaid was over. Justice had not come from the barrel of a gun, but from a woman's eye for detail, an old man's dusty records, and the united voices of men who had refused to be broken. That evening, back at the ranch, a profound peace had settled over the scarred land. The threat was gone. The future, which had been a dark, uncertain road, was now open before them. Mary stood by the creek, the same creek that had almost claimed her, and watched the water, now flowing freely, gurgle over the stones. Caleb came and stood beside her. They were quiet for a long time, listening to the sounds of the evening. "I need to tell you something," he said at last, his voice low. He did not look at her, but at the moving water. "That day, when I found out about the ticket, when I told you that you had to leave, I need you to know why." Mary held her breath. "It was not because you came here under a false name," he said, and he finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "My wife, she died of a fever. Before her, the war took my brother, this land, this life. It takes everything you love if you are not careful. I learned to close myself off, to not hope for anything, to not trust anyone. It was safer that way." He took a hesitant step closer, and then you came. And with Ellie, and mending the men's shirts, and calming that horse, I started to feel something I had not felt in a very long time. I started to trust that maybe there was still some good in the world. And when I found out you had lied to me, I was not angry at the lie. Mary, I was terrified. I was terrified of that feeling, of trusting and being made a fool of again. It was easier to be angry than to be afraid. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Wanting to send you away was the most foolish thing I have ever done. I was pushing away the only good thing that has happened to me, to this place, in years. I am sorry, Mary, for ever wanting you to leave." "I was afraid, too, Caleb," she whispered. "I have been running for so long. I did not know how to stand still." He reached out then, not to take her hand, but to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle. The touch was not one of passion, but of a deeper, quieter connection. A partnership forged in fire and a promise of a new beginning, rising from the ashes. The season of new grass began with the rain. It came softly at first, a gentle, percussive tapping on the roof of the small cabin that the men had built for Mary and Ellie near the main ranch house. Then it settled into a steady, life-giving rhythm that washed the last of the ash from the blackened soil and turned the air clean and cool. The irrigation ditch they had dug with their bare hands now ran full and clear, a silver artery carrying water to the heart of the thirsty land. And in the burned pastures, impossibly, miraculously, tiny shoots of green began to push their way through the charcoal earth. Hope, it seemed, was a stubborn thing. The town of Willow Bluff was changing, too, with Pike and Kincaid gone. A quiet sense of order had returned. Marshal Evans had stayed for a week, his calm authority dismantling Pike's network of corruption with methodical precision. He appointed a new, honest sheriff, a man who wore his star with a sense of duty rather than menace. The biggest change for Mary came in the form of a notice posted outside the general store. The federal government was looking to hire an assistant for the newly appointed postmaster, someone who could read, write, and keep accurate records. Mary told Caleb of her intention one morning as they stood by the corral. "I am going to apply for that position," she said, her voice steady. Caleb looked at her, his face serious. He did not question her or try to dissuade her. He simply nodded. "You will need to use your real name," he stated, "Mary Whitlow." "Yes," she replied, a small, brave smile touching her lips. "It is time." Riding into town that day felt different. The stares that followed her were no longer hostile, but filled with a quiet, curious respect. She walked into the post office, a small building that smelled of ink and sealing wax, and presented herself to the new postmaster, a kindly man with spectacles and a gentle demeanor. She did not speak of her past. She simply filled out the application form in her neat, precise hand. Mary Whitlow. She wrote the name with a sense of finality, as if she were closing a book on a long, painful chapter of her life. She was hired on the spot. Her new life settled into a peaceful rhythm. She would spend her mornings sorting mail and keeping ledgers, and her afternoons back at the ranch, a place that had become more of a home than any she had ever known. The work in town was more than just a job. It was a public declaration. Every letter she stamped, every parcel she handed over, was an affirmation of her identity. She was Mary Whitlow, a respectable working woman, a part of the community, the ghost of Eliza, the mail-order bride, faded with each passing day, becoming a faint, distant memory. One warm afternoon in late summer, Caleb asked her to walk with him. He led her away from the ranch, past the growing pastures, to a small grove of aspen trees on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. Their leaves, like 1,000 tiny golden coins, shimmered and danced in the breeze, making a soft, rustling music. It was a place of profound peace. They stood in the dappled shade, looking out at the land, at the new fences and the healthy cattle, at the thin curl of smoke rising from their own chimney. Caleb turned to her, his face earnest, his usual stoicism stripped away, leaving only a raw, vulnerable honesty. "Mary," he said, his voice low and a little rough, "I have not been a man of many words. I have spent years building walls around myself, thinking that was the only way to be safe. You have torn them all down." He took a deep breath, his gray eyes searching hers. "I am not asking you to stay because of any debt you might feel you owe me, or because this ranch needs a woman to help run it. I'm asking you to stay because of you, because you are kind and brave and honest in a way that matters more than any name on a ticket. I am asking because my life before you was a long, quiet winter, and I cannot imagine facing another one without you." Tears welled in Mary's eyes, blurring the golden leaves of the aspens. Before she could answer, a small figure appeared at the edge of the grove. It was Ellie. She walked toward them shyly, not speaking, her face a study in childish solemnity. In her hands, she held the small, beautifully carved wooden horse. She stopped in front of Mary and, with a quiet reverence, held it out. It was not a gift of a toy. It was the offering of a heart, the surrendering of a past and the asking of a future. It was a child's way of saying, "From now on, this is your home." Mary knelt and took the small horse, her fingers closing around the smooth, worn wood. She looked from the child's hopeful face to Caleb's, her own heart so full she thought it might break. "Yes," she whispered. The word meant for both of them. "Yes, I will stay." Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was held on a clear, crisp autumn day, not inside the church, but outside, under the vast, open sky. Their friends were there, the loyal, weathered cowboys from the ranch, a shy but smiling Mr. Abernathy, and the Reverend Hale, who had come not just to officiate but to celebrate. Mary did not wear a white gown. She wore her best gray muslin dress, and over it, as the cool breeze stirred, Caleb gently draped his own heavy leather coat. It settled on her shoulders like a warm, protective embrace, a silent vow that he would always shield her, always be her strength. The promises they made were simple, their voices clear and steady in the quiet afternoon, words of partnership and devotion that were as solid and real as the land beneath their feet. The rains came that year, gentle and steady, and the ditch they had built together carried the water faithfully to the thirsty land. The green shoots in the burned pasture grew into a thick, lush carpet of new grass, and the cattle grew fat and content. The town of Willow Bluff, having witnessed the fall of a tyrant and the rise of a quiet, resilient love, learned a lesson in grace. Minds were opened, and hearts, long closed by suspicion, began to soften. One morning, just as the sun was rising, Caleb and Mary stood on their porch, mugs of hot coffee warming their hands. The light spread across the valley, a tide of gold and rose, catching and glinting on the steel wires of the new fences. The barbed wire, that symbol of strife and division, that tool of Pike's greed, now stood as a quiet guardian. It was no longer a weapon that caused pain, but a shield that kept their herd, their land, their family safe. The sharp points that had once threatened to tear them apart now defined the peaceful boundaries of their home, a testament to a love that had been forged in fire and a future that was, at long last, their own. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.